Okay, thank you. I think we may start. We may start this presentation of this book, Christian Democracy and the Fall of Communism, edited by Michael Gehler, Piotr, Kosicki, and Helmut von Holt. I wish to welcome all the participants to this presentation, both people here and the many, I imagine, that will be connected from their homes. And I wish to begin also thanking all the people who will contribute to this presentation. It is beginning with Professor Laura Fasanaro, then Professor Giovanni Bernardini, and with a special thanks to Professor Kosicki, which is connected from Maryland, the US, for being here. I am really pleased to open this presentation because this is an initiative that had to take place 2 years ago. The book we are presenting today was published in November 2019. It was exactly the 3rd anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was an initiative scheduled here for March 2020, and it was blocked by the COVID-19. So, recently, the steering board of Civitas thought possible to add it to the academy, the Civitas Academy, reserved to young scholars and young researchers on Christian democracy, in order to offer this presentation both to our community and to the international public from remote, to the public in Rome, and to the young scholars here. There is a second reason for my satisfaction today. It is that this is the first Civitas publication. We started a series titled Civitas, Studies on Christian democracy. And this is the first volume. A second volume will follow shortly. It will be devoted to Christian democracy in exile. It will appear before the end of the year. And it will study the attitudes of Christian democratic movements and parties in front of the fascist regimes, in front of communism, and in front of the military dictatorships in Latin America. The series, it corresponds to Civitas' mission. We are a network of institutions, of archives, and of scholars devoted to the study of Christian democracy, and the series is intended as an opportunity for publishing innovative studies in a comparative and global perspective to Christian democracies. That is our intention, our aspiration, if possible, is contributing to situate Christian democracy in the broader 20th century history. The origin of the book is one of our annual conferences. It was the conferences held in Vienna in 2016, but this is not a book publishing the proceedings of an international conference. Civitas wishes and requires that every edited volume will be an autonomous self-justifying, if we want, entity. And I am sure that this is the case because I know that the three editors have selected materials, added new contributions, asked to totally revise and rewrite others, and they have written two impressing and very deep introduction and conclusion pages. So this is, I think, a totally new product. I stop my introduction to this point. I would ask Professor Kosicki, who is one of the three editors of the volume, if he likes to add some general information and presentation of the book before starting with the reactions of the people who have read it.
Thank you very much, Professor Moro. I'm audible. You can hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Excellent. I don't know who's in the room, so hello to everyone in the room. Hello to my esteemed colleagues on the panel. And I regret that I don't think Michael Gehler or Helmut von Uth are in Rome, if I understand correctly, right? So I'm sorry that I'm the only representative of the editorial team that prepared this book. Renato Moro already introduced the context. This is a book that stems or originated with the idea for a conference on Christian democratic and conservative parties and their stance on the decline of the opening of the East, actually, I believe was the original title of the conference. As it happens, I was not involved in organizing the conference in Vienna. I was brought in afterwards, and in some sense, I'm the editor who managed the editorial process for the book. So I can speak to the way that the book, the final concept came together. I wasn't involved in the original concept, but I'm immensely pleased and very pleased with my collaboration with all of our collaboration together with Michael and Helmut. It was really a great process, and I think a good result has followed. The book really has three sections to it, each of which stands on its own, but which I think really benefit from being in the same volume. One examines the stance and attempted involvement and some measure of success, although also a good bit of failure, and that's something we reflect on at length, of Christian democratic parties from Western Europe and West Central Europe. Obviously, the Federal Republic of Germany and Austria are very prominent in the book in trying to create, revive, give life to Christian democracy behind the Iron Curtain in the 1980s and as the Iron Curtain was falling at the turn of the 1980s and 90s. Then another section of the book looks from the perspective of Catholic activists emerging from the Iron Curtain. There's a bit of attention to folks who had been active in exile, but really mostly about newer, younger generations that actually created or attempted to create Christian democratic parties, especially and most notably in Hungary, but also in Czechoslovakia as well, especially the Slovak portion of Czechoslovakia. And then the third section of the book is looking at complementary movements, These in particular, and also the Christian labor movement. And Professor Kim Christians had a wonderful chapter, really, which opens the book on the World Confederation of Labor. And I just wanted to say that I don't see the book without these three sections together. Professor Michael Gehler wrote the introduction overviewing the process of the collapse of the communist system in the East. I wrote a conclusion much more pessimistic than I had anticipated when I was first approaching editorship of the book, basically reflecting on how Christian democracy failed to take hold and failed to become a unifying transnational phenomenon across the former countries of the Soviet-dominated European East. And as a scholar, especially among others of Poland, I'm particularly interested in how Poland dramatically and totally failed to develop a serious mainstream Christian democratic movement after 1989. So, as Professor Moro has said, the book has already gained some reception. My mind has moved on somewhat also because, as fate would have it, I am co-editor also of the second Civitas book, the one that Renato Moro announced, which is forthcoming in 5 weeks, I believe, with Leuven University Press also. So hopefully Wolfram Kaiser and I will be doing another tour, hopefully not on Zoom, hopefully in person, but promoting that book soon. But the Civitas 1 volume has already gotten very good reviews on H. Diplo, in the journal Slavic Review, which is really the flagship interdisciplinary journal of Russian East European studies. You may not even know that yet, Renato, because it just came out, I think, 2 weeks ago in the review in Slavic Review by Geoffrey Hosking, who's a very distinguished British historian of 20th century communism. And then also in the Archives des Sciences Sociales de Religion by Yvon Tronvouet. All right, I'll be quiet. I look forward to the comments from our colleagues. Thank you again for inviting me to participate.
Piotr, thank you very much. I did not introduce you because I thought you were so well known to the international public that was necessary, but thinking of the Italian public probably, I may add that you are professor of contemporary history in Maryland, that your main work is the monograph about Catholics on the Barricades, Poland, France, and the Revolution, 1891-1956, that you have contributed many books as editors or co-editors. One of them is the one we are presenting today, and that you are, as you may perceive, a real expert in the history of the relation between East and West, and especially Central and Eastern Europe. That's all. So I will give the floor to Professor Fasanaro, adding only that Laura is a colleague and a friend in many ways, and that she is professor of History of International Relations at Roma III, with a specific in research and also teaching interest in 2 fields, one history of European integration and the other the new environmental and especially environmental, I think, crisis and their impact on international politics. Laura is also an expert in the history of the 2 Germanys and the relations between Italy and the two Germanys. So the floor is yours.
I hope you can all hear me, even the colleagues from. I hope so.
Try the microphone.
I think so. I think it's connected directly to.
It's working.
Così? Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this presentation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here to comment on this impressive collection of essays. It's a collective book that refers to a number of interconnected themes that I will try to sketch out in my brief comments, and then I hope we have time for discussion also with one of the authors, with Professor Kosicki. So first of all, I will say that I think this is in many ways a groundbreaking book, since it investigates for the first time the transnational dimension of European Christian democracies, and I put emphasis on the plural because I think it's important, and European Christian democratic parties and movements, both in the West and in the East, at a critical time in European history, which is the years immediately before and the years immediately after the turning point in 1989-1990. And I think that one first reason why this is not only an outstanding but also an original and groundbreaking book, is that it shows how comparative and international research have become paramount for a historically transnational political phenomenon like the Christian democracy, for a transnational political family like the Christian democracy. The book is of great relevance not only for contemporary history but also for social history, international history, and the history of European integration, where clearly the Christian democracy has played an historically prominent and driving role in Western Europe. So one of the issues that comes out while reading the book is that it's difficult but still very significant to compare the role played by the Christian democracy in Western Europe in the aftermath of World War II and the other role played by Christian democratic parties and movements in Eastern Europe in the aftermath of 1989. It's two turning points that somehow are treated in a very interesting comparative way. Another reason for the importance of this book is that it expands the knowledge on the diversity of the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet bloc. Recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a strong effort put by international historians and historians of European integration to, and contemporary history as well, to deepen knowledge of Eastern European societies, political cultures, and of this diversity. We explore through this book a multifaceted context in Central and Eastern Europe, which cannot be interpreted anymore simply by making reference to these countries' submission to Moscow's directives, nor to their belonging to an ideologically driven alliance. There is a much more complicated and again multifaceted context, which has been explored, among others, by a number of, by some European projects, like the one carried out led by Federico Romero and Angela Romano in the field of international history, looking into the relations between Central and Eastern Europe and the European community. And in this sense, this book completes or goes into this diversity of the Eastern Bloc. And at the same time, it deepens the understanding of Eastern as well as Western European political, economic, and cultural integration. This is again another effort put by international history and contemporary history to better understand what kind of integration, economic and political integration, developed in Eastern Europe in parallel to what was happening during the Cold War in Western Europe. The book also deepens the understanding of another kind of diversity, the diversity of Christian democracies, of Christian democratic political parties and Christian democratic movements, and I would say also Christian democratic political cultures. I would keep on using the plural in Europe, and raises a number of questions on the legacy of Cold War political cultures in today's Europe. The book unveils, furthermore, a number of aspects of the Christian democracy's concept of change and on the ability of Christian democratic parties and movements to manage transitions, the ability or the difficulty in managing transitions. It interrogates itself on the breadth and the scope of the relationship between the Christian democratic political culture and liberalism in many ways. And in the different countries that are analyzed in the book. It finally raises questions and provides a number of very impressive, interesting answers to the critical point of the Christian democratic political culture's embedment into the European People's Party and the European Parliament. This is also very important. the Christian democracies analyzed in this book are not only the kind of synthesis that we find in the European People's Party at the European Parliament, but it's a much broader scenario that includes the Christian democratic political parties of the European People's Parties, and all the controversies and the contradictions between those parties that inside European People parties completely identify themselves with the values of the Christian democracies, and the others, some of the Christian democratic movements or personalities in Eastern Europe who never completely identified with the same values. Finally, and this is a last but I think very important point, the book explores the value and potential of transnationalism in the Christian democracy's history. And it let us interrogate ourselves also on the transnational dimension of other political parties during the Cold War, of course, beginning with the social democracies. This point is particularly underlined by Professor Kosicki in his analysis of the Polish context and the missing opportunity for the Christian democracy in that country post-1989 to take a more assertive, a stronger role. In the Christian democracies, in the Christian democratic parties and movements of Central and Eastern Europe, there seems to be a continuous underlying I would say dialectics and maybe competition between transnationalism and nationalism that is particularly strong in Central and Eastern Europe, and which turned out to be, after 1989, much more important and rooted than transnationalism in Central and Eastern Europe's Christian democratic political cultures. I found it particularly interesting, this comparison made by the authors between the success of the Christian democracy in Western Europe post-1945 and the demise of the Christian democracy in Eastern Europe post-1989, arguing that in the former, so in Western Europe, it was the totalitarian right to be discredited, whereas in Central and Eastern Europe post-1989, it was the totalitarian left to be discredited. Although one might maybe add that in the first case, post-1945, it was both the totalitarian right and the totalitarian left that were somehow discredited, and one of the reasons for the success of Western European Christian democracies was that they were able to be anti-fascist and anti-communists at the same time. I will go back for a minute to the issue of the diversity of the Soviet bloc, this monolith which is not a monolith. The Soviet bloc is really very diversified in many ways. The book casts new light on the diversity of reactions and the participation, the reactions of Christian democratic movements to the ongoing transformation process, and their participation, the different role they played in each countries. And in this sense, it brings new and fresh insights into this multifaceted context. I would say that, today we know that from contemporary history that at the roots of the historical change that took place between 1989 and 1991, there were many factors, domestic and international ones. Michael Gehler sums them up, recalls the economic decline, the ideological and political erosion of communist rule, as well as the administrative and structural deficits of the so-called real existing socialism. I'm quoting him. And he also quotes the big factor, the Gorbachev factor. We know that the scenario is much more complex than we analyzed it 20 years ago. And in this book, this diversity is recalled also in describing the different phases of the revolution in each country. In Poland, it was a revolution prepared from below with a strong participation of the church. In Hungary, it was a negotiated one. In the GDR, it was unexpected, unprepared, and somehow due also to the demise of the army, of the leadership, a couple of weeks before the real fall of the Berlin Wall. In Czechoslovakia, it was a double revolution, the Czechs and the Slovaks. In Bulgaria, it was an unfinished reform or a Bulgarian semi-perestroika. In Romania, it was a bloody one, corrupt, confiscated, a mixture, here again I quote Michael Gehler, of popular uprising and a coup d'etat. And then the Baltic states, a different context, but also a different kind of identification of these countries with their own culture as opposed to as a non-Soviet country. In their differences, these revolutionary phases reflected, on the one hand, the weaknesses of each socialist party and leadership, which is peculiar. Each one had their own weakness. They reflected each of the Central and Eastern European regimes' different relationship with Moscow, of course. They reflected different expectations and different ambitions. The East German regime, for example, remained very ambitious up to the end, in spite of its deep indebtedness with the West and with West Germany in particular. For some of them, for some of these countries, the Catholic or the Protestant Church played a stronger role, like in Poland and the GDR. In other cases, a role was played by the existing unsovietized culture, like the Baltic states. In other cases, like Romania and the GDR, there was a broad involvement of the media, which did not exist in other countries. And in some cases, like Hungary and the GDR, a big role was played by the fleeing people, the mass exodus of East German and Hungarian citizens before the revolutions in 1988 and 1989. What were the similarities of all these revolutions, considering the differences? What were instead the similarities? Well, first of all, the high involvement of young people everywhere. And this is underlined in this book. We find all the references to this common, this fil rouge across these different revolutions. Then this sense of frustration or unachieved goals, or the feeling of an incomplete process left behind by the old communist leadership, which is connected also to the split between the party leaderships and the bases and the people. And I think that maybe one of the points raised here is that this sense of frustration was the Christian democracies in Central and Eastern Europe were probably unable to grasp entirely how important was this feeling of frustration and this feeling of a partial revolution or an unachieved revolution. And this could be one of the reasons why in the aftermath of 1989 they were much weaker than the Christian Democrats of post-World War II in Western Europe. And then the other very interesting point raised in this book is, I mentioned it before, the relationship between transnationalism, nationalism, and nationalist illiberalism, which is part of the political cultures of Central and Eastern Europe and which challenged the Christian democratic values in Central and Eastern Europe in the aftermath of 1989. This nationalist illiberalism that we find both in certain movements and in certain personalities quoted and analyzed in the book seems to me at least, in line of continuity from the revolutionary events of the 1980s to the present in the opposition and juxtaposition between the Visegrad Group and the European Union, Brussels. So this opposition between this relationship and opposition between nationalism and liberalism in the 1980s is one of the interesting, probably, points that lead to a legacy of these political cultures today. The other point I would like to raise and maybe to put to discussion is that the fall of communism coincided in some European countries with the very crisis of the Christian democracy, in some Western European countries, in other countries with a revival of its values and political project, and with its political rediscovery and strengthening, like the case of the German Democratic Republic and the elections of March 1990. This is an interesting point because it gives us the idea of, again, the aftermath. It raises questions on the aftermath, what remained in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe of the experience made in the West, in Western Europe, of this fall or demise of the Christian democracy in some countries and the success in other countries, or the further spreading of the values, the true values of the Christian democracy. The context of European integration, of Western European integration, I go into my conclusions. The context of European integration needs also to be taken into account, and is often quoted and mentioned in this book, which is really broad and comprehensive in its analysis. The Europeanization of the German question in the aftermath of 1989 and with a view to the reunification of Germany, the prospect of the enlargement to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. While I was reading the book, I thought that one of the possible new lines of research that it opens is to look into the personalities, the officials of Central and Eastern Europe that went to work at the European Union. What kind of political culture did they bring with themselves? Was it the Eastern or the Western, or the bridge between the two created by these transnational organizations analyzed in the book, or even explored inside the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is one of the chapters of the book? I think that this book is I started by saying it's groundbreaking for a number of reasons, but I also think that it has one main value, which is to open a number of questions for further research. We are at the academy, so this could be an input. One of them is to look into the following years, what happens when enlargement becomes real, and it's not in 2004. It's in the mid of the 1990s that the European Union realizes that something bigger is happening, and that this process will take efforts and energies to be carried out. So in this phase, what kind of role do Western European Christian Democrats play? We know from some of them, of course. We know much less from the Eastern European. And what kind of role do they play in the education of the young officials? Because there is also a new generation of officials and experts that go and work into, or prepare themselves for the work at the different DGs of the Commission and so on. And then one last question that I would maybe raise, I have a couple of, if there is time, but I will raise at least one for the author, for one of the authors connected with us, is what do you think are the successful, or what do you, it's for Professor Moro as well, think are the successful aspects, elements, the successful initiatives in which the Western Christian Democratic parties supported the process of transformation ongoing in the country of Central and Eastern Europe in the 1980s. I think this book raises a lot of questions. It's very comprehensive in the period of time it takes into consideration, more or less from 86 to 91, 92, but it fruitfully opens a number of questions on the years before and on the years afterwards, especially in connection with the perspective of the enlargement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for your contribution. I've read the book, of course. I find many of the arguments you have raised and analyzed central in the books, and the questions you were posing at the end of your interventions are fundamental. For example, this last question, the successful aspects and the actions of the Christian Democratic parties toward the Central and Eastern Europe. Well, the book, as I have perceived it, is demonstrating in a certain way that, for example, the Catholic milieu, that is, spontaneous religious groups, trade unions, probably were more effective than the Christian Democratic parties themselves. This is a problem. We have to listen to Professor Kosicki and hear directly from him what he is thinking about a subject like this. So thank you very much. Now I would ask Giovanni Bernardini to intervene for his comments or observations of the book after his reading of it. I thank him for having so kindly at the last moment accepted to make this presentation. Giovanni Bernardini is professor of contemporary history in the University of Verona. He is a specialist in history of European politics with a focus on Germany and on German foreign policy. In particular, he has devoted books to this, the relation with the US, the issue of the question better of South Tyrol. He has also devoted attention to the politics after the end of communism. He has devoted a beautiful essay to the relations and contacts and also comparisons among the Italian and German political cultures and the end of communism. So welcome, thank you again. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Renato Moro, for inviting me. Thank you to the Istituto Sturzo. I'm sorry, I apologize for not being there, but some academic duties kept me very far from Rome. Not as far as Maryland, but quite far from Rome. I'm very happy to be part of this presentation for two reasons. First, the first is because it's a very good book. It's an innovative book, very interesting, especially for non-experts of Christian democracy as I am. And also because one of the editors, Michael Geller, which is not here, I think, edited a book which I was part of on the Europe and the German unification. And I wrote a chapter, I mentioned this just because I wrote a chapter on the Socialist International and German, I would say, and European unification, yes. While Michael Geller wrote a chapter on the People's Party, European People's Party, and the German unification. So we had this role of covering the two big families. So just to say that I'm an expert of the other political families, so don't expect too much from me. But anyway, I have a few points. I have some suggestions for the next book, a comparison between the influence of the socialist parties and the Christian Democratic parties on the evolution in 1889, 1990. So first, I was surprised when I started reading this book by one point that Piotr Kosicki, is that correct? Kosicki mentioned at the beginning of his introduction. So it's a pessimistic book in some way, but especially from an historiographical point of view, there's a surprising lack of triumphalism. As we know, Cold War triumphalism has been very dangerous in politics. Very well what happened during the 90s and during the first decade of the new century from a political point of view, what happened about US unilateralism, but also in Europe with an excess of optimism in the economic field, excess of optimism in the European integration process, including the big enlargement of the European Union. And we should not forget that it was a Christian Democrat who opened the way to the big enlargement was Romano Prodi as a president of the European Commission. Triumphalism has also been a problem for historiography. The narrative, the common narrative on 1989, 1919 was a success story. And it was an obstacle for a real understanding of what have happened in 1989, when that happened, which means not only in 1989, but started before 1989, ended after 1990. And for some analysts, some of the contributors to the volume, there is a longer transition that did not end in 1999 and which is still ongoing. If we look at the political systems in the East, we are still in the middle of this transition, of which 1989, 1990 was, of course, an accelerating moment, but not the beginning and not the end of the whole transition. So, what I found in the book, I try to make a comment for the whole book, not focusing on specific chapters. I found a sober assessment, or many sober assessments, of the role played by each of the external actors in the transition in 1989-1990, which means that in each chapter, the authors are focused very much on what role they played, what was their contribution to this evolution, and what was the contribution to this evolution, and what was the consequence of this intervention. In the case of Christian democracy, this was a hugely plural contribution with different parties coming from different traditions, coming from different way of operating abroad. There is a mention, many mentions in the book about the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is a very peculiar experience in Western Europe. You don't have anything comparable to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in other countries of Western Europe, for sure. Second point that I found in the book, and this is very important, the transition. 89 as part of a process which started at least since the 1970s or early 1980s, and which did not conclude until today, maybe. So in this respect, the role played by Christian democracy is much more balanced than it was in the common narrative until a few years ago. Because all the SS says that the influence was important, but was not long-lasting, and that no Christian democracy emerged in any countries of the East. I remember very well when Piotr says, even in the most Catholic country in Europe, Poland, there is no such thing as a Christian democracy. So the book starts to think on the reason why this happened. And this is, of course, a major task, and the book fulfills only part of this goal, but this is normal. It's something we will have to deal in the future, and we have to be ready, as the authors are, to change our interpretations according to what happens after today. What will happen in the future, what will happen in these countries as part of this evolution, which started in 1989 or even earlier. Finally, and this is a point that Piotr makes clearly in the conclusion at which emerged in some of the contributions, 89 is part of a longer European process which did not start even in 1945 or 48, which is even longer, which takes, I would say with Hobsbawm, the European short 20th century. For example, the contributions on the emigres in Western Europe, contribution on the Lithuanian movement with its roots in the pre-Second World War, times, but also in other as this point is highlighted, and it's so important to me that I will come back to this at the conclusion of my comments. All the chapters, the readers of this book in the future, all the chapters of the first and the second part acknowledge the fact that the Christian democracy played a role, but that, I quote, the Christian democratic moment was a moment. The long-term legacy proved to be more ambiguous or limited, as Michael Geller underscored in his introduction. Which are the reasons for this very dark assessment? As Piotr said, many of the contributions tell more about the country in the West which tried to influence the East than the countries in the East themselves. Which means that the Cold War triumphalism implied a vision that Western Europe was solid as a rock and Eastern Europe was moving after '89 toward the West. This is not real. This is not a real picture. And the history of Christian democracy proves that, because Christian democracy had evolved enormously. Christian democracy in 1989 is not the Christian democracy of the 1950s. Was still one of the major political families in Europe, but has changed a lot. Even its tenets has changed a lot. The book mentions that even, let's take the chapter by Michael Geller on the role of the European Democratic Union. Even the European Democratic Union was a successful story in influencing the evolution of the East, but it was the result of a failure in the West, the result of a fracture among Christian democratic parties in the West. So in this respect, Christian democracy was evolving. Let me mention, in one chapter, there is a mention on the crisis of Christian syndicalism in the West during the 1970s, for example, 70s. Let me refer to the phenomenon of secularization and detachment from the church. And maybe this was one common point between the West and the East, since we know by the chapters of this book that one of the problems of Christian democracy in the East was the lack of religious sense in some countries and the lack of interest for what the church had to say for the political life in the East. So in this respect, Christian democracy was rapidly changing. Christian democracy was also absorbing in the West since the 1970s some of the principles of neoliberalism. It also had changed a lot its economic doctrines. So there's no reason to be surprised when the chapters in the book say that the new leadership in the East were much more interested in neoliberalism than in traditional Christian democracy, since neoliberalism seemed to be the winning doctrine in the 1989, 90, and after during the 1990s. So in this respect, neoliberal moment was a moment, and the results could only be very limited in favoring the end of communism, but not the birth of Christian democracy in the East, and not in influencing the general trend of the evolution of the East. It was very limited. Now, if we focus on the narrow horizon of 1989-1981, what emerged from the book? First, of course, as Laura has mentioned, the importance of non-state organizations. This is a peculiar feature of Western European history. Syndicalism, also party organizations, cultural organizations, church organizations. But what was the real influence of these non-state organizations in the East? I would say that they encouraged and accelerated the immersion of anti-communist activities and organization, but had a limited impact on their evolution because the political space in which they were competing was different from the Western one. So in this respect, they encouraged the emergence of a new social plurality in the East, but not the evolution of the social pluralities, just because the political arena was different from the Western one where they were born. In this respect, the most successful story of the book, told by the book, is as Professor Moro mentioned, the Taizé community, which had an important role in the evolution of the East. But which role and which evolution? Of course, this was a non-state actor, and this was not a party actor, was not linked to the Christian democracy, of course, and it promoted a sense of faith and religion in the East, but not the evolution toward a form of party. So in this respect, it was successful because the goal was different from the goal of the other the real Christian democratic parties operating in the East. Anyway, the book confirms one feature of the history of 89-91, the importance, even the history of the 1980s and the early 1990s, the polyphony of the Western society and their influence on the monolithic nature of Eastern societies, in influencing the evolution of this monotheism, showing that the West was the place where different forms, very different form of association, of thinking, of religious beliefs could be tolerated. But I stress this point: society versus society, not the influence on the evolution of the political system. Second point, very important in the book, is the role of transnational, international fora, institutions, and organizations. And this is the case with the CSCE follow-up conference. I think this point is still giving some great results in understanding what happened in Europe and beyond during the 1980s and 90s, what happened in the evolution of these countries in the 1990s. And I think the essays, the chapters of this book encourage new contributions in this point. They are opening, again, new fields of research in this respect. Finally, with the collaboration of all these institutions toward the common goal of ending the communists in the East, we have the feeling of an unintended plural strategy from the West, which finally undermined the Eastern regimes. But again, it was good to undermine the Eastern regime, not enough to build new regimes in the East, according to the desires of the Western actors. So let me end with two considerations. First, let's go back to the long-term perspective. We know that Christian democracy had a longer story, longer than 1989, of course, but that this was the moment, the real Christian democratic moment. The Christian democracy forged the European integration process, forced the birth of liberal democracy in Western Europe, forged what is called Western model, let's say. On the other hand, let's look on another transition, a very important transition, which occurred in Europe and which had a very different conclusion from the Eastern transition, the transition of the Iberic Peninsula. During the 1970s, early 80s, two countries in Europe witnessed an evolution, a very important evolution from totalitarian regimes to democracy. In this case, the two major European political families were able to promote, to even build parties which were much more homogeneous to them. And this led to two political systems and two new states which were much more homogeneous to the Western models. So these two experiences, Portugal and Spain, were not shorter than the communism in the East, if we think of it Salazarism started during the early 30s. Franco's regime in Spain dated back to 1939. So what is the difference between what happened in the Iberian Peninsula and what did not happen in the East? Sometimes we have the same strategies, sometimes we have the same actors, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in the German case. The results were very, very different. So I think we should focus on more on this point, and I would like to read a new book focusing more on this point. My very personal suggestion, if I go back to some essays that I read recently by a German sociologist, Klaus Hoffe, he suggests that national illiberalism has much more to do with some forms of national illiberalism which were circulating in Eastern Europe before World War II, than with the Western system. So in this respect, maybe we should see a specific evolution of Eastern Europe, which started after 1919, after the First World War, which was in some respect covered or reinvented during the communist era, but without changing some major tenets, and which re-emerged during the 1990s and during the new century. Just an example, and in this respect, I would say it's a provocation. It's more important to me the national than illiberalism. I mean, the nationalism is a very strong point, which was overcome in Western Europe by also thanks to some transnational families like Christian democracy. If we think what happened in Western Europe in terms of reconciliation, if we think of 1984, Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand holding their hands in front of the monument in Verdun. So it's, you see, a transnational and trans-party reconciliation. And let's think to Orban telling every day about the Trianon and what happened in Trianon to Hungary, still after more than 1 century of this event. So maybe to understand what was not, what really happened in 1989, we should go back to a long-term history of the 20th century, which also includes the Christian democracy as important part of this story. Last point, really, I suggest to Piotr, maybe there is a book which can be done on these topics, a comparison between the influence of the Christian democracy and the social democracy in Eastern Europe. And some of these points are already potentially in your book, like the role of non-governmental organization. I stress this point because it's still very important, and there is so much to understand about that. The role of international organization, so how Christian Democratic Party and Social Democratic Party interpreted the role that international organization can have in the transition in the East, could have in the transition in the East. But also the case of the parties and individuals in exile. This was a very important point. I try to, I focus on this point in my chapter on Socialist International and the transition in the East. The fact that some of the groups of the exiled members of earlier social democratic parties were still credited as the new leaders for the future in the East, but they were not, of course. They were living in the West since too many decades to understand what was going on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So I think this will tell us more about the competition between the two major political families in Europe and tell us more about the transition in 1989. But I don't want to give Piotr too much work to do. He still has done a very good book, a good job with this book, and my congratulations to him and to the other editors and to all the contributors to the volume. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Bernardini. Another very stimulating intervention, even if Piotr will have to write 2 or 3 new books in order to accomplish your suggestions. I think that now is the moment to listen to Piotr himself, as what his reactions to what he was listening to.
To La Fasanaro and Giovanni Bernardini for their very careful readings, their very generous comments, and I'm pleased to say, of course, I can only take partial credit for this. As I mentioned, the original concept behind this entire project was not even mine. I certainly put my imprint upon it, and I can fully take credit for the conclusions essay. And I think I said most what I think in there. So in that sense, and both of you were reacting to it. There were several specific questions that you posed, which I want to address. But while you were both speaking, I was thinking about what else I might highlight from the book. And there is one particular case. I'm thinking here of the question with which Laura concluded about successful aspects and initiatives. And in some sense, it has to do with what I actually thought was maybe one of the biggest contributions of the volume, but neither of you mentioned, which is the role that Austria played. And the reason why I bring this up, and I'll be honest, the conference was based in Vienna. My colleagues and fellow co-editors, they're Austrians. And I remember looking at the initial offerings at the conference and thinking, this is about Austria and a lot of other places. And I was kind of joking when I said that to myself, but it really is true in the sense that the success story in the book, fundamentally, if you were looking for one, is of Austria and Hungary. Now, it's a limited success story in part because Josef Antal died early and young, right? So in that sense, the development of Christian democracy in Hungary took a different trajectory in the 1990s because Antal's movement fell apart. And what instead gained steam was a kind of, is exactly what you were just saying, Giovanni, a reincarnated party, reanimated partly with folks from exile, partly with money from various Western European structures that became Hungarian Christian democracy, which is now in Orban's government, right? I mean, his deputy prime minister is the head of that party. And in that sense, well, I'll come back to nationalism and illiberalism in the 21st century in a moment. But I did want to underscore that between the story of the follow-up CSCE process, the European Democrat Union story, and then just the bilateral story, the relationships that Alois Mock and his colleagues from the Austrian Volkspartei developed with Hungarian colleagues and nurtured throughout the 1980s, there was actual groundwork being laid. And for me, that is the story that could have been that went nowhere. And in some sense, it's very different from both the Czechoslovak and the Polish stories. And of course, there are a lot of other stories, right? It's difficult for me. And I remember thinking this the first time I read the first draft of Michael's introduction, which I think is a wonderful introduction to the book. But I remember thinking, are we really kind of kidding ourselves, including Bulgaria and Romania and in the conceptual frame? And my sort of way around that, and I think we all agreed, was that Lithuania would be an interesting way of talking about a very different set of circumstances and problematizing also something that Laura said about the two post-1945 totalitarianisms. Because of course, the Lithuanian Christian Democratic Party had members who were fascist collaborators during World War II, right? So in some sense, its process of self-redefinition after World War II was very different than the process of self-redefinition of these other Christian democratic parties, especially the Polish one that ended up in exile effectively, at least partly, from 1940 onwards, and only partly, if ever, returned from exile. So if I may just make two quick points then, after having highlighted what I find to, if we're thinking of the world of Christian democratic parties and structures, Austria to be interesting, first because it was neutral, second because you had those organic bridges, and third because there's a question also tying to what you had said about periodization at the end, Giovanni, about Habsburg legacies. And I want to come back to that in just a moment. The first point that I want to make actually in some sense also is plugging our next Civitas book publication, which is that some of the questions that you both raised are actually addressed in the next book that I co-edited, the one that Wolfram Kaiser and I basically conceptualized initially for a conference in Bonn, and then redeveloped and built into a book about Christian democracy and exile, partly because that book includes stories of exile from Italy, from Spain, from Franco's Spain, and from Pinochet's Chile, as well as the Communist East. And the comparison contrast is quite interesting. In the end, I mean, I don't know how far I would take it. I was thinking while you were talking, Giovanni, about the Iberian Peninsula and the notion, which I agree, certainly compared to Eastern Europe, it's a success story in terms of what the mainstream West European political families were able to achieve. But that being said, it faced some of the same dilemmas, which I think benefit from this kind of fine-grained comparative analysis that you were both talking about. Namely, if you set the experience, let's say, of not just the Spanish language, but the Basque or the Catalan Christian democratic exiles, which is something that there are separate chapters on those in the forthcoming book. Then you start to see processes of entanglement and generational change, which in the case of the Catalans really proved devastating, for example. In the case of the Basques, perhaps less so. But when we look at Christian democracy refracted through the lens of exile, it becomes easier to understand why there was such a problem finding interlocutors, or at least stable interlocutors, in the transition from the late 1980s into the mid 1990s, as the Iron Curtain was coming apart and as the Adenauer Foundation, the Austrian People's Party, and to a much lesser extent, and I think this is maybe the chapter that for me underlines most clearly what Giovanni was saying about the transformation of Christian democracy in Western Europe, the Democrazia Cristiana, which really had a very hard time finding its footing with respect to the transition because of its own profound crisis of the time. But the interlocutors were completely unclear. The Polish case, I don't like generalizing from it. Of course, it's prominent because it is the most Catholic country, and also it had the most stable Catholic Church, both institutionally speaking and also socially speaking, in terms of the independent space for religious activism, in spite of the challenges and the repressions on a mass scale throughout the communist period. But the Christian Democrats from before World War II, who had never been that strong in Poland, had been regionally based, because Poland also is larger than these other countries, right? Population and geographically. They really became very, very important figures in Western European Christian democracy and also in global Christian democracy. The monograph I'm working on speaks to that. Sometimes they collaborated with social democrats too, like in the 1960s, right? There's a great story of Adenauer, sort of the emerging Adenauer Stiftung and its cooperation with the German social democrats in Latin America, in the building of certain structures in Venezuela, in Chile. That story ends with the Pinochet coup, but it makes for an interesting contrast, I think, with Eastern Europe, where social democracy is tainted from the get-go. To the extent that Christian democracy has structural problems, social democracy equals post-communism, right? In almost all of these, if not all of these countries. And so it's impossible to break the logjam partly because of the position of the nomenclatura, partly because the resources were simply there, and resources tended to flow on the social. I feel like I'm stepping into your territory, Giovanni, in terms of generalizing about socialists and social democrats. But for me, it is clear that the Christian Democrats had more of an opportunity in principle, at least in terms of a kind of startup capital of public confidence and legitimacy, if I can put it that way. Whereas in the Polish case, it just so happened that unlike Antal, who wanted to embrace Christian democracy in Hungary, even though he came from this kind of third way, middle ground, had been very publicly active, hadn't been a raging dissident throughout. He was never communist, but he was never really a raging dissident either. You have Tadeusz Mazowiecki in Poland, who had effectively been a Stalinist in the 1950s in his youth, had never really stopped believing in Catholic socialism, and made this conversion in spite of himself that he never forgave himself for, to neoliberalism when he hired Leszek Balcerowicz to be his finance minister and deputy prime minister in 1989. So Poland is a story of clashing ideologies that arguably don't really make a lot of sense in terms of the long-term personal intellectual trajectories. You know, Helmut Kohl also ran into another problem with Mazowiecki when Mazowiecki turned him down, right, for the prospect of building a Polish Christian Democratic Party. And that was that Mazowiecki had a knee-jerk reaction, even though he spoke German well and he had built relationships like with von Weizsäcker and a lot of other prominent West German Christian Democrats. He just really hated the political economy of the Federal Republic of Germany. And that never left him. I think since the 1950s, one of the things that had made him so actually sympathetic to a fusion of Catholicism and communism in his youth was this idea that West Germany was bad in a moral sense, but also in the model of political economy that it had absorbed from the United States, and in the idea that social market economy was never really so social. Obviously, that's Mazowiecki, but there's an element of this, I think, permeating a lot of the bloc. And then there's the generational problem too. The exiles coming back, in most cases, are too old to understand what was going on. The dissidents who were younger, it didn't mean anything to them, the vocabulary. Sure, there were some who joined these nascent or reborn Christian democratic parties, but they were never positioned to really lead and to define the ideological tenors. The post-communist social democracy was decisive. And then there was this sense of defining national sovereignty as a fundamental trajectory. And you're right, that leads back to the aftermath of World War I. And in some sense, I have a hard time as I revisit this book and I think about the concluding essay that I wrote, thinking through these larger conceptual categories: transnationalism, nationalism, liberalism, illiberalism, because Christian democracy embodies all of them and none of them, arguably, in this transition. And I think it's not a very helpful, perhaps, explanation, but one could argue that part of the failure of Christian democracy to carve out its own space in Eastern Europe across this long transition from the 80s into the 90s, separately from that story of contingent circumstance in the Austro-Hungarian relationship, is the broader sense that it was never really clear where ideologically the ground was to be centered. Third way, for sure, but third way could mean any number of things. And other political parties were much better at defining themselves as the parties of national sovereignty. And also, with the passage of a decade or two, as the European integration process that Laura was talking about, what enlargement became more and more and more real, the younger generations defined their positions more and more clearly and were able to stake themselves out in ways that no longer really reflected the stakes of the 1980s and 1990s. So Orban may be famous for having gotten up on the stage at the reburial of Imre Nagy in June of 1989, right? He really established his public persona that way, but he's able to, from his position of representing something dramatically different ideologically, to say, I haven't changed. And it's partly because he was so ill-defined early on. So just having a public persona and being involved and broadly staking a claim to national sovereignty, I think has allowed for this, it's not a falsification. It's simply a selective and superficial sense of continuity, which means that none of the tough questions associated with what it means to be a Christian Democrat in 21st century Europe ever really had to be posed. And as far as being a social democrat in 21st century Europe, well, that just means trying to get over post-communism. Whereas the center right to right could tackle any number of other issues and pivot to what we've seen in the past few years has been an incredibly effective upsurge of transnational illiberal populism. And it really works for a lot of these forces. And that's partly why, I don't like talking about Polish politics in 2020-21, because it's very, very, very depressing. And I'd be even more pessimistic if this book were being published now and if I were writing the conclusions now than when I was writing those conclusions 3 years ago. But I want to thank you both again for your very rich and generous readings. I hope that others read the book as carefully as you both did. And I wanted to say, just as a last thing to Renato Moro's point about trade unions, I think that it's true. And I wouldn't overemphasize political parties here. We conceptualize this book as a mosaic of different forces. And in some sense, it's about sort of understanding that Christian democracy had to be part of a larger constellation for it to have any impact at all beyond the immediate months and year or two of the transition. And in that sense, I think that the impact is there, even if the identification has been lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotr. Thank you very much. I don't know if there is somebody from remote or here who wishes to make comments, observations, questions. Seem not. So I think we may conclude. I would conclude with a further observation. The next book we may try to publish. This is not anymore the task for Piotr, but a collective task. That is, we have much debated about the consequence of this missing Christian democratic spring after 1989. But I think that the story that we have been told in this book is also very important for Western Christian democracy. That is, I think it is an hypothesis of work that the end of communism was a turning point also for Western Christian democracy, and in a certain way it is possible that changed it deeply. Of course, there were Christian democratic movements and political parties before the Cold War. Democrazia Cristiana in Italian, Murri, the Sillon in France, the Italian Popular Party led by Sturzo, yes. And so there will be, will continue to be Christian democratic parties after the fall of the wall. But in a certain sense, it's possible to imagine that the great season of the Christian democratic parties, this is this 1945, 1989, in a certain sense, I would not say ended, it is too much, but new a deep transformation. The case of EDU, that is the European Democratic Union, is very telling in the book. This is the problem of an opening to conservative parties, abandoning the label of Christian democracy and passing to an EPP at the European level open to forces that are not anymore clearly Christian Democrat. Well, it is a turning point, and it comes directly out. It was not born with the end of communism, but accompanied it and received greater strength from the fall of the wall. So in a certain sense, a new book may be a reflection about these three historical phases in the history of Christian democracy and the deep differences they have. So thank you to the editor of the book again for raising this kind of interrogatives, and thank you to the contributors, to Laura Fasanaro and Giovanni Bernardini, for their reading and comments of the book.